Welcome, and thank you for being here. You're listening to Sleepy Historian, a place where history is allowed to move slowly, where nothing rushes toward a conclusion, and where you're free to rest while the past quietly unfolds around you. Before we begin, you don't need to focus too hard. You don't need to remember names or dates. You can simply let the words pass by, settling where they wish, while your body does what it already knows how to do, ease, soften, and grow a little heavier with each breath. If at any point you drift, that's perfectly fine. This story will keep going calmly, whether you're listening closely or only half aware or not aware at all. Tonight, we're talking about Victorian Christmas. Not the version you might be picturing. Not the one made of glowing windows, full tables, cheerful music, and endless warmth. That version, the one most of us carry, is a comfortable lie. It's an image built long after the fact. A memory shaped by books, cards, and later traditions. A version softened by time, distance, and modern comfort. But if you had been there, really there, Christmas in the Victorian era would not have felt safe or warm. It would have felt long. You might imagine stepping into a Victorian home in December and feeling welcomed by heat. But instead, what you would notice first is the cold. Not a sharp cold, not a dramatic one, but a slow, persistent cold that never fully leaves. It sits in the walls. It settles into the floorboards. It lingers in the heavy furniture, in the fabric of curtains, in the air itself. Even indoors, your breath might faintly show. You would feel it as soon as you stopped moving. Victorian winters arrived early and stayed late. By the time Christmas came, winter had already claimed weeks of daylight, warmth, and energy. The short days were not a novelty. They were a burden people had been carrying for some time. And Christmas did not lift that burden. In many ways, it added to it. You see, celebration did not mean rest. Tradition did not mean comfort. And the idea of Christmas as a pause from hardship would have felt unfamiliar to most people living through it. Instead, Christmas arrived in the middle of winter's pressure. It demanded food when food was already scarce. It required energy when bodies were already tired. It asked for cheer when warmth itself was limited. This is not a story of sudden suffering. There is no single dramatic moment, no sharp turn. It is a story of endurance. If you were there, you would wake in darkness. You would dress in layers that never quite did enough. You would move carefully, slowly, saving energy without thinking about it. You would feel the day stretch ahead of you, even though daylight itself would be brief. The cold would not announce itself loudly. It would simply remain. Victorian homes, especially for the working and lower classes, were not built to hold heat well. Coal fires helped, but only in certain rooms, and only while fuel lasted. Once the fire weakened, the room cooled quickly. And Christmas did not change that reality. Even in better-off households, warmth was uneven. Some rooms were kept cold deliberately to save fuel. Others were used only briefly. Large houses often felt colder than small ones, their size working against them, drawing heat away into unused space. You might picture heavy fabrics, thick curtains, layered clothing, wool blankets, and yes, those existed. But they were compensations, not solutions. They slowed the cold. They did not remove it. Christmas meals, when they happened, were moments, not states of comfort. A brief gathering around food did not undo weeks of hunger or months of rationing. And for many, even the Christmas table was modest. Expectation often exceeded reality. Religious obligation added another layer. Church services meant leaving what little warmth you had, standing or kneeling for long periods in stone buildings colder than the homes you came from. The body learned to endure stillness in cold air, to accept numbness as normal. And when night came, because night always came early, it brought the hardest hours. Darkness settled quickly in winter. Gaslight and candles offered limited reach. Shadows filled corners. Fires were banked low to conserve fuel. Sleep, often imagined as refuge, became its own quiet risk. Too much stillness meant cold crept deeper. Too little rest meant exhaustion. People learned to sleep lightly, to wake without alarm, to adjust, shift, and endure without fully thinking about it. Children felt winter differently. So did the elderly. So did those who worked through the night, or those who had no reliable shelter at all. Christmas did not shield them. It simply arrived anyway. And this is the part of history that is often left out. Not because it is shocking, but because it is uncomfortable in a quiet way. There were carols, yes. There were gatherings, sometimes. There were moments of warmth and meaning. But they existed inside a season of strain, not above it. And so, as you listen tonight, imagine Christmas not as a glowing centerpiece, but as another long day in winter. A day shaped by habit, by routine, by the careful management of energy, heat, and food. Imagine waking knowing the cold will follow you from room to room. Imagine planning movement not by desire, but by necessity. Imagine night not as rest, but as something to be patiently endured until morning. This is the Victorian Christmas most people lived. Not dramatic, not cruel, just demanding. As we move forward, we'll take our time. We'll move through homes, through days, through nights. We'll notice the small adjustments people made without naming them. The ways the body learned to survive quietly. If you're listening late at night, let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. You don't need to stay alert. You can rest here. And if this story fades into the background as sleep comes, that's exactly as it should be. Before we continue, a small, gentle note. If you find comfort in these long histories, you're welcome to like the video, or subscribe, or leave a quiet comment about where you're listening from. Only if it feels right. There's no need to do anything now. For the moment, simply stay here. Winter already has its hold, and Christmas, as we'll see, does very little to loosen it. By the time Christmas arrived in the Victorian world, winter was no longer something approaching. It was already present, already settled, already shaping daily life in ways people rarely questioned, because there was no alternative. You would feel this first inside the home, not outside, where cold was expected, but indoors, where you might hope for relief. Victorian houses, for most people, were not built to protect warmth. They were built quickly. They were built cheaply. They were built to stand, not to insulate. Heat was something you created in small pockets, not something the house held for you. If you step inside one of these homes in December, you notice it almost immediately. The air does not feel welcoming. It feels still, heavy, and cool. Even after the door is closed behind you, the cold follows you in. Walls are thin, often damp. Brick and stone draw warmth away rather than keeping it. Floorboards allow drafts to rise slowly from below, brushing ankles and calves without warning. You might pause near the fire, instinctively. Everyone does. The hearth is the heart of the house, but its reach is limited. A coal fire warms what is close. A chair pulled just a little too far away feels the difference almost instantly. Beyond that narrow circle, the room remains cold. You learn where to sit. You learn where not to linger. In many homes, only one room is heated regularly. The rest are left cold, doors closed to preserve what little warmth exists. Bedrooms upstairs are often colder than outside air, especially late at night, when heat sinks downward and stone stairwells act like funnels. You climb into those rooms knowing what waits. Beds are cold when you first touch them. Sheets feel stiff. Blankets offer weight, but not immediate warmth. And the house itself never fully warms. Even after hours of firelight, the walls remember winter. Windows are another problem. Glass is thin and uneven. Cold presses through it easily. Frost forms on the inside, delicate patterns spreading slowly overnight. Curtains help, but only slightly. Heavy fabrics block drafts, but trap dampness. In the morning, they feel chilled to the touch. You do not open windows for fresh air in winter. You tolerate stale air instead. Smoke lingers. Soot settles quietly on ledges, on mantles, on the backs of furniture. Breathing becomes shallow, without conscious thought. Even in better-off Victorian homes, warmth is inconsistent. Large rooms with high ceilings are difficult to heat. Corridors stretch long and cold, connecting spaces like channels for drifting air. A person walking through the house learns to move efficiently. You do not wander. You do not linger in doorways. You close doors behind you carefully, preserving what warmth you can. Servants, when present, move constantly, feeding fires, adjusting grates, carrying coal. Their labor creates heat for others, but rarely for themselves. In working-class homes, the problem is sharper. Coal is rationed carefully. Every shovel added to the fire is a calculation. Too much now means none later. Fires are allowed to burn low for long stretches. They glow rather than blaze. They warm slowly and never completely. At night, fires are banked or allowed to die back. Fuel must last. Morning fires take time to revive. You wake cold, not because something has gone wrong, but because this is normal. Houses, in this way, teach the body to accept discomfort. Cold is not a crisis. It is a condition. You feel it in your hands first. Fingers stiffen. Movements become deliberate. You feel it in your feet, especially on bare floors. Rugs help, but only where they exist. The house dictates posture. You sit close together. You keep hands tucked in side sleeves. You pull shawls tighter without thinking. Even standing still feels different. You sway slightly, shifting weight, keeping blood moving. Children learn these habits early. They are not instructed. They observe. They learn where warmth gathers. They learn which corners of rooms are always colder. They learn that winter inside the house is not an exception. It is the rule. At Christmas, nothing structural changes. The house remains the same. The walls still pull warmth away. The windows still bleed cold. The floor still chills the feet. Any celebration exists within these limits. A Christmas candle adds light, not heat. Extra cooking warms the kitchen briefly, but once the meal ends, the cold returns. There is no sense that the house will protect you overnight. Instead, you protect yourself from the house. This shapes behavior in quiet ways. You gather in smaller spaces. You abandon unused rooms entirely. You sleep closer together. Furniture is rearranged for winter, pulled nearer to the hearth. Unused chairs sit untouched, cold to the bone. Sound behaves differently in cold houses. It carries farther. Footsteps echo more sharply. The house feels hollow, even when occupied. Silence becomes heavier at night. The structure itself feels watchful, not in a threatening way, but in a constant presence. Every draft reminds you where the house fails. Every cold wall marks a boundary. You do not fight it. You adjust. And by Christmas, most people are already deep into this adjustment. Winter has already shaped their days, already taught their bodies what to expect, already thinned patience and energy. Christmas arrives inside this reality, not outside it. If you're listening now, imagine sitting in one of these rooms. The fire is low. Your hands are wrapped in cloth. The walls around you are cool, unmoving. You're not in danger, but you are not comfortable either. And this balance between endurance and acceptance is where Victorian winter life begins. Is almost equal to 250 words. By the time winter fully settled in, clothing became less about appearance and more about endurance. And yet, even when fully dressed, warmth was never guaranteed. Victorian people wore many layers. That fact is often repeated, but it is rarely understood. Layers did not mean comfort. They meant delay. You begin with the underlayer, usually linen or thin cotton, worn close to the skin. It absorbs sweat and moisture, but it offers almost no insulation. If it becomes damp, it pulls heat away instead of keeping it in. Over that comes wool, when available. Wool holds warmth better, but it is heavy. It restricts movement. When worn constantly, it stiffens at the joints and rubs the skin raw in places. For many, wool garments are worn day and night. There is no separate clothing for sleep. You remove as little as possible because every layer removed is warmth lost. Still, the cold seeps through. You feel along seams first, where fabric overlaps, where buttons meet cloth, where sleeves end at the wrist. Hands remain cold no matter how tightly they are wrapped. Gloves exist, but they limit work. Many remove them repeatedly, exposing fingers to air that bites and stiffens. Feet suffer quietly. Shoes are thin by modern standards. Soles allow cold to rise steadily from the ground. Stockings help, but once damp, they become liabilities. You keep moving not to stay busy, but to stay warm. Outdoors, wind cuts through fabric easily. Indoors, the problem is stillness. When you stop moving, the cold finds you. Heavy coats help outside, but they are rarely worn indoors for long. They are bulky, awkward, and difficult to work in. Instead, shawls, wraps, and layered skirts are used, adjusted constantly throughout the day. You pull fabric tighter without noticing. You hunch slightly. Posture changes with temperature. The body learns these adjustments instinctively. For women, skirts are long and layered, which helps somewhat, but the weight is exhausting. Fabric brushes cold floors, picking up chill that travels upward. Men wear coats and waistcoats, but gaps remain. Cold settles at the lower back, at the neck, at the ankles. Children wear what can be spared. Clothing is passed down, patched, altered. Gaps in size mean gaps in warmth. You can always tell when a child is cold. They become quiet. Movements slow. Hands disappear into sleeves. At Christmas, clothing does not improve. There is no special winter gear suddenly available. What you have is what you've been using since autumn. Festive clothing, when it exists, prioritizes appearance over warmth. Stiffer fabrics, decorative elements that trap cold air. You endure them briefly, then return to practical layers as soon as possible. Night brings its own challenge. Removing clothing before sleep is risky. Keeping it on is uncomfortable. Most choose a compromise. You loosen garments, but do not fully undress. Stockings remain on. Shawls stay wrapped. The bed is cold at first. You curl inward, minimizing exposed surface. Clothing traps some warmth, but not enough to feel secure. You lie still, letting body heat slowly accumulate. If you wake during the night, the cold feels sharper. Clothing has shifted. Gaps have formed. You adjust quietly, careful not to disturb others. For those who work outdoors or in unheated spaces, clothing never truly dries. Dampness becomes constant. Cold deepens. Fabric smells of smoke, sweat, and soot. It stiffens when exposed to frost. Morning dressing is an exercise in patience. You rub hands together, stamp feet, wait for sensation to return. No amount of layering fully solves the problem. Clothing slows heat loss, but it cannot overcome the environment. Cold presses inward steadily, hour after hour, and so the body adapts again. Circulation shifts. Extremities sacrifice warmth for the core. You feel alert and dull at the same time. Hunger increases slightly, but food is limited. The body burns energy simply staying functional. At Christmas, expectations rise, but resources do not. People still attend church. They still visit when required. They still sit still for long periods. This is when the cold becomes most noticeable. You sit on hard benches. Stone floors radiate upward. Breath fogs the air. Clothing helps, but only just enough. By evening, fatigue sets in, not from work alone, but from constant resistance. The act of staying warm takes effort, and by the time Christmas Day arrives, no one is surprised by this. Winter has already trained them. Cold is not dramatic. It is persistent. Clothing is not protection. It is negotiation. And this negotiation continues, quietly, endlessly, throughout the season. Winter did not arrive all at once, and neither did the body's reaction to it. The change happened gradually, almost politely, so slowly that you barely noticed when comfort slipped away. At first, the cold felt external, something you could step out of, something clothing might manage. But as weeks passed, the cold began to settle inside you. Your body responded in quiet, practical ways, not with alarm, not with urgency, just small adjustments repeated every day. Circulation changed first. Blood favored the center of the body, the chest, the abdomen, the organs that mattered most. Hands grew colder more often. Feet took longer to warm. You noticed tingling less, numbness more. It was not frightening. It was familiar. Muscles tightened slightly, even at rest. You carried tension without realizing it. Shoulders lifted. Jaw clenched faintly. Posture shifted toward conservation. You sat differently. You stood with weight balance to reduce exposure. You leaned closer to heat sources without thinking. Sleep changed too. You slept lighter in winter. Not by choice, By necessity, the body remained alert, even in rest, listening for changes in temperature, waking when the fire faded or the wind rose. Dreams were shorter. Sleep was fractured. You might drift off, wake briefly, then drift again. This pattern became normal. Appetite followed. The body asked for more fuel, but food was limited. Meals were filling but repetitive. Bread, broth, what could be afforded? Hunger sharpened attention but dulled energy. By December, fatigue was layered over everything. Not exhaustion, just a constant, low heaviness. Movements slowed slightly. Reactions softened. You chose efficiency over speed. The body conserved. Skin changed. Dryness crept in. Cracks formed at knuckles and lips. Cold air stole, moisture relentlessly. Small injuries healed slowly. Cuts lingered. Bruises remained visible longer than expected. Illness did not arrive dramatically. It drifted. Coughs lingered. Stiffness stayed longer each morning. Recovery took time. The elderly felt this first. They moved less not because they wanted to, but because warmth required stillness. Energy became precious. Children adapted differently. They burned energy quickly. They played until numbness forced stillness. Then they became quiet, suddenly tired. Parents watched for this change carefully. The body's signals were subtle, but understood. Cold did not shout. It whispered. By Christmas, most bodies were already altered. The holiday did not mark the beginning of hardship. It arrived in the middle of it. You woke on Christmas morning feeling much like you had the day before. Cold, stiff, alert. There was no sudden cheer that erased discomfort. Only ritual layered over routine. Church attendance required long periods of stillness. This challenged the body the most. You sat on cold benches. Breath slowed. Limbs chilled. The body responded by tightening inward. Fingers curled. Feet tucked beneath hems. Spines leaned slightly forward. Afterward, relief came not from warmth, but from movement. Walking home restored circulation briefly. Sensation returned with pins and needles. Back indoors, the cycle repeated. By evening, the body was tired in a way that sleep did not fully solve. Winter fatigue was cumulative. Each day added weight. And yet, this was normal. There was no expectation of escape, only endurance. Bodies were not fighting winter. They were adjusting to it. Cold was not an enemy to defeat. It was a condition to survive. The body learned restraint. Energy was not wasted on unnecessary motion. Speech softened. Gestures became smaller. Even emotions flattened slightly. Joy existed, but quietly, contained, measured. This restraint is often mistaken for misery. It was not that. It was practicality. The body understood the season better than the mind. By late December, you no longer waited for warmth. You accepted its absence. Comfort became brief and localized. A moment near the fire. A sip of something warm. Enough to continue. Winter had already done its work. By the time Christmas arrived, the body was no longer resisting. It had learned how to last. By the time Christmas arrived, hunger was already familiar. Not the sharp, sudden kind. Not the dramatic absence of food. This was a quieter hunger. Persistent. Managed. You lived with it daily. Meals in winter were shaped less by desire and more by calculation. What could last? What could be stretched? What could be warmed again? Bread formed the center of most tables. Dense loaves, dark with grain, cut carefully, never thickly. Broth followed. Water clouded by bones, vegetables, or whatever scraps remained. It warmed the hands more than it filled the stomach. Meat was present less often than memory later suggested. When it appeared, it was portioned precisely. Every cut mattered. Christmas was expected to change this. Not because food suddenly became plentiful, but because tradition demanded the appearance of plenty. Expectation weighed heavily. Christmas carried rules. You were meant to prepare more, serve better, present abundance, even when it was borrowed or delayed. Households saved for weeks, sometimes months. Small sacrifices accumulated quietly. A candle not lit, a garment not repaired, a portion eaten smaller than usual, all to create one meal that looked generous. The meal itself often came at a cost. Extra labor was required. More fuel burned. Longer hours spent standing in cold kitchens. Hand worked stiffly. Water chilled quickly. Ingredients were guarded carefully. Nothing was wasted. Bones were cracked. Fat was saved. Leftovers were planned before the meal even began. You did not eat freely. You ate deliberately. There was pressure to appear satisfied. Children were told this meal mattered, that it was special, that it should be remembered. Adults smiled more than they felt. Voices softened. But hunger does not vanish because a date changes. The body still asked for more. Servants felt this most sharply. They prepared food they would not fully enjoy. They carried dishes through cold corridors. They stood longer than others. When they ate, it was later, sometimes alone, often with what remained. Religious expectation deepened the strain. Christmas was not only a meal, it was an obligation. Attendance at church meant long hours without food or warmth. Fasting rules lingered in memory, even when officially relaxed. The morning passed slowly. Hunger sharpened attention. Cold made it worse. By the time food was served, the body was already tired. Eating brought relief, but also heaviness. The body struggled to process rich food after weeks of restraint. Stomachs ached. Fatigue followed quickly. There was no indulgence without consequence. For the poor, Christmas meals were often symbolic rather than filling. Charity existed, but unevenly. A loaf here, a bowl of soup there. Enough to mark the day, not enough to erase winter. Some waited for these offerings quietly. Some did not receive them at all. Pride kept many silent. Expectation was heavier than hunger. You were expected to be grateful, to be reverent, to show joy, even when the meal barely met the body's needs. The contrast between promise and reality lingered. Christmas stories spoke of feasts, of overflowing tables, of generosity. Reality offered careful portions and tired digestion. After the meal, stillness returned. The fire burned lower. Energy faded. Food did not bring wakefulness. It brought sleepiness. People sat quietly. Children leaned against walls. Conversation slowed. Hunger receded briefly, but not completely. It would return by morning. The body knew this. It stored what it could, held warmth briefly, then released it. By nightfall, Christmas felt much like any other winter day. The difference was not comfort. It was effort. Extra effort for a single pause in scarcity. The expectation of abundance did not remove hardship. It layered responsibility on top of it. Food, like warmth, was managed, not enjoyed, and the body adapted. It learned to accept less, to function on what was available, to continue. Christmas did not save anyone from hunger. It only reminded them of what abundance was supposed to feel like. As Christmas approached, days were already long and cold, yet there was little time to rest. Religious expectation demanded attention. Rituals, prayers, and long church services. The day itself was not just a marker for celebration, but a series of duties that shaped every movement, every moment, every breath. You were expected to rise early, often before sunrise, to prepare yourself and your household for worship. Layers of clothing were adjusted, sometimes hastily, to navigate the chill of morning air and drafty interiors. Each step, each motion was slower than you wished, burdened by the weight of cold and anticipation. Even a brief pause to rub hands together or inhale the warmth of a fire was considered a moment of care rather than indulgence. Church was central, though far from restful. Pews were stiff, hard, and unforgiving. The stone floors transmitted cold directly through worn shoes, chilling your feet despite woolen coverings. Gaslight or candlelight illuminated faces, flickering shadows revealing quiet discomfort. Long hours of standing or sitting in prayer were expected, with minimal opportunity to adjust or move. Your body resisted, stiffening in ways that were familiar yet demanding, muscles tense, joints cold. The mind followed a slower rhythm, aware of each passing moment, yet distracted by bodily sensations that demanded attention. Families walked together through narrow, icy streets, boots crunching on frost-hardened surfaces, breath visible in the air. Each step carried a sense of purpose, a reminder that attendance was not optional. Missing even a part of the ritual was frowned upon, a breach of etiquette and devotion. Children learned to mimic the solemnity of adults, but fatigue and cold showed in their small movements. Fingers twitching, toes pressing against cold boots, heads tilted for warmth. Even within the church, the day offered little warmth. Fires were kept low to prevent smoke and soot from overwhelming the interior. Stone walls absorbed heat rapidly, radiating cold back into the space. You could feel the contrast acutely between the brief moments near a flickering candle and the sweeping drafts along high arches or narrow aisles. It was an endurance test in stillness. Eyes followed the slow gestures of clergy and the gentle rise and fall of prayers, while your body quietly urged motion, adjustment, or even rest. Outside, the processions of people created a muted symphony of movement and sound. Footsteps echoed in streets, bells chimed at intervals, and voices, soft yet persistent, recited lines of prayer or scripture. Each sound marked the slow passage of time, the day's progression toward evening and the next cycle of duties. You observed others, noting their cautious steps, the bending of heads, the subtle fidgeting, each gesture a reminder that comfort was secondary to obligation. Meals were secondary to devotion. The day's structure allowed only small pauses, often standing or in cold kitchens, preparing food that would be served later. Servants carried out instructions silently, balancing efficiency with quiet respect. Fatigue accumulated in their shoulders, knees, and hands, yet their movements remained precise, a testament to routine and learned endurance. Hunger persisted, unrelieved by the occasional scraps that could be sampled amidst preparations. By afternoon, exhaustion became more visible, yet ceremony continued. Even those accustomed to cold and hardship felt the slow pull of fatigue, shoulders slumping, eyelids heavy, breaths deeper and slower. Movement had to remain measured. Sloppiness, fidgeting, or visible discomfort was frowned upon, often suppressed with conscious effort. The psychological weight of expectation intertwined with the physical weight of winter's cold, creating a subtle tension that persisted quietly through the hours. The repetition of ritual reinforced endurance. Hymns and readings followed familiar patterns. Phrases repeated, gestures repeated, hours repeated. You felt time stretch, both in its dull continuity and in the anticipation of reprieve. Yet the reprieve was measured, a brief chance to warm near a hearth, to sip water or a thin broth, before returning to duties. Sleep remained distant, a luxury deferred for obedience, not indulgence. Evening drew near without relief. Cold lingered in every corner, every floorboard, every stone wall. Candles burned low, shadows grew long, and the day's rituals required a final effort. You walked home slowly, boots heavy, muscles stiff, feeling the contrast between the warmth of hearths you passed briefly and the pervasive chill outside. For children, the journey home was both wondrous and taxing. Excited anticipation layered atop fatigue, cold pressing against small bodies, lessons in quiet endurance etched into memory. By nightfall, bodies had endured hours without the modern comforts we expect. Heating, cushioned seats, soft flooring. You were aware of every shiver, every stiffening joint, every slow heartbeat. The mind, dulled by the repetition of obligations and physical stress, registered the day as long, relentless, and demanding. Yet compliance with religious duty ensured social and spiritual survival. A structure that the modern eye may admire, but one that required constant, quiet sacrifice. Sleep, when it finally came, was tentative. Bodies sought warmth, alignment, and relief. But the residual tension of obligations, combined with hunger and lingering cold, meant that rest was lighter than imagined. Even in bed, muscles remembered the long day, bones retained the chill, and minds processed rituals that stretched hours beyond physical comfort. It was not a restful night. It was a measured continuation of endurance, preparing for the next day, the next set of obligations, and the continuation of life within constraints dictated by season, society, and expectation. Christmas, in Victorian times, demanded a quiet heroism, not in battle, not in spectacle, but in the persistent, patient management of body and spirit against cold, hunger, and ritual. Each participant, child, servant, or elder, practiced subtle acts of survival, learning to navigate discomfort while maintaining the appearance of devotion. The day's religious obligations were a vessel for this endurance, embedding lessons that would echo through long winters and many future celebrations. The idea of Christmas as a time of joy and abundance was, in Victorian England, often a quiet illusion. For most households, the season brought little relief from winter's grip. Instead, it layered additional strain on lives already measured by cold, hunger, and relentless labor. The very act of celebrating required effort, endurance, and patience, turning what we now imagine as festive indulgence into a prolonged exercise in survival. Preparations began days in advance. Kitchens filled with the smells of baking, simmering stews, and roasted meats. Yet the labor behind these smells was physically taxing. You might observe servants rising before dawn, hands raw from cold water and flour, knees stiff from long hours on hard stone floors. Coal fires demanded constant attention, never allowed to burn low for too long, lest the warmth disappear and the work halt. Even brief moments of pause to breathe, to rub cold fingers together, or to lift your gaze from monotonous stirring were quickly replaced by the next task. Repetition became the rhythm of endurance, the backdrop to the faint sounds of pots clanging and embers crackling. In larger households, the number of expectations multiplied. Families hosting guests could not simply rest. There were tables to set, fires to maintain, and the appearance of abundance to create. Every movement was calculated to preserve energy while sustaining the illusion of comfort. Heavy fabrics were arranged, windows scrubbed to minimize frost, candles lit strategically to mask shadows. Yet all these efforts reminded you of the underlying lack. The cold, persistent and invasive, crept through walls, under doors, and through cracks in floors, emphasizing the contrast between appearance and reality. Children were both observers and participants in this endurance. They were expected to help, to participate in rituals, and to maintain composure. Yet their small bodies were more vulnerable to winter's bite and the added pressure to behave joyfully, even when hungry or tired, demanded a quiet stoicism. Smiles were often learned behaviors, practiced to please elders or match societal expectation, rather than spontaneous expressions of contentment. Every misstep, every quiver of discomfort, was a subtle lesson in restraint, shaping young minds to endure while masking the body's natural responses to cold and hunger. The physical burden on adults was no less pressing. Extra meals required preparation, sometimes multiple times a day, each task more arduous than the last. Servants moved deliberately, balancing heavy trays, stoking fires, and replenishing candles. Householders themselves managed errands, sometimes venturing into streets slick with frost or soot, negotiating the distance between home, market, and church. Each journey was a negotiation with cold, fatigue, and exposure. By the time meals were served or carols sung, bodies were already weary, and yet the expectation of cheer remained. Social duty was inseparable from physical endurance. Even the symbolic acts of celebration contributed to strain. Decorating with greenery required climbing ladders, bending, and lifting branches. Trees, if the household could afford one, had to be carried in, positioned, and maintained near delicate heat sources to prevent wilting. Cards were written, sometimes by candlelight, each stroke of ink a slow, deliberate movement under the shadow of tired fingers. Gifts were wrapped with care, though scarcity often limited options, amplifying pressure to appear generous within material constraints. Every gesture, while meant to convey warmth and abundance, reminded participants of what they lacked and the effort required to mask it. Hunger itself persisted despite the appearance of feasts. Portions were often smaller than imagined, particularly for servants or children who received scraps after the household's main needs were met. The contrast between expectation and reality. The idea of a Christmas feast versus the modest provisions exacerbated both physical and psychological strain. You felt each bite, each sip, as a reminder that comfort was not fully attainable, that the body's demands remained largely unmet, and that endurance was the primary form of participation. Noise, too, played its subtle role. Carols, laughter, and music filled spaces not with relief, but with the insistence that joy be expressed. Every song required vocal effort. Every movement accompanying it demanded energy that cold had already sapped. The soundscape, while festive, acted as a quiet reminder of exertion, blending with shuffling steps, creaking floorboards, and the faint crackle of fires. Sleepiness pressed against consciousness, yet duties and expectations prohibited surrender. The day's rhythm was a delicate balance. Enough activity to fulfill societal norms, yet not so much as to collapse entirely. As evening fell, the strain reached a quiet peak. Rooms dimmed, fires slowly reduced to embers, and the cumulative fatigue of hours pressed on every shoulder and spine. Yet rituals persisted. Prayers, family games, storytelling, or the final serving of meals. Each act demanded attention, precision, and careful pacing. The night stretched onward, cold seeping deeper as exhaustion made warmth feel more distant. Even those accustomed to hardship recognized the subtle cruelty of expectation. The closer the day came to its symbolic apex, the more palpable the bodily strain and the quieter the comfort. Through all this, a subtle psychological endurance emerged. Victorian Christmas required a negotiation between obligation and survival, between the desire for warmth and the need for compliance. Those who persisted learned the rhythm of extended strain, the timing of fatigue, and the practice of quiet self-management. The celebration itself became a mechanism of endurance, teaching that ritual and survival were inseparable, that the body and spirit were both instruments of measured control. By the night's end, participants, children, adults, servants, felt the combined weight of cold, labor, hunger, and expectation. Sleep offered relief, but only partially. Memories of the day were not of unmitigated joy, but of sustained effort, endurance framed by ritual, and the quiet observation that Christmas, for most, was a season not of comfort, but of disciplined perseverance. The faint warmth of embers, the slow crackle of dying fires, and the tactile reassurance of layered clothing provided minimal comfort, a reminder that survival, even in celebration, demanded attention, patience, and quiet resilience. As evening deepened, the castle or townhouse settled into a stillness that belied the quiet struggle taking place. You might think of night as a pause, a moment of rest, but in Victorian homes, especially during winter, night was a test of endurance. The darkness was complete, unbroken by electric light, with only flickering gas lamps, smoldering embers, or a single candle offering faint warmth and illumination. Shadows stretched across stone floors, wooden beams, and frost-patterned windows, highlighting the insufficiency of walls, floors, and ceilings to hold in the day's meager warmth. Bedrooms were sparsely heated, if at all. Even the wealthiest households could not escape winter's chill entirely. A single hearth or stove might serve multiple rooms, the heat barely reaching the far corners where drafts seeped relentlessly. Floors, often cold stone or thin wood, radiated chill upward, and mattresses were stuffed with straw, hay, or coarse wool, materials that offered little insulation against frost creeping through window panes and under doors. You felt the cold through multiple layers of bedding, twisting and shifting to trap as much heat as possible while avoiding the discomfort of compressed, uneven stuffing beneath you. Beds themselves were compact, often shared among multiple family members or children to preserve warmth. The practice of close sleeping was less about intimacy and more about practical survival. Bodies huddled together, exchanging whatever heat could be retained, each breath forming visible clouds in the frigid air. You could hear subtle movements, the shifting of limbs, the careful tug of blankets, the soft sighs of those attempting to settle despite aching joints, stiffened muscles, and the persistent reminder of cold. The body, even when resting, worked quietly to maintain its minimal warmth, drawing on reserves that would be tested further as the night deepened. Even with layered bedding, clothing remained on many sleepers through the night. Woolen garments, nightcaps, and heavy underlayers pressed against skin, stiff and slightly abrasive, yet essential to reduce heat loss. You might imagine the discomfort, fibers rubbing, seams pressing, collars and cuffs tugging. But the alternative, the gradual seep of cold into core muscles, demanded persistence. The skin prickled, and fingers and toes slowly lost their warmth, the sensation almost imperceptible at first, then steadily insistent. Breath formed faint mist in the air, a visible reminder of the temperature that enveloped every surface. Windows, often single-pane and drafty, allowed frost to creep inward. Curtains, heavy and layered, were drawn as tightly as possible, yet cracks and gaps let in cold currents. Floors near doors, stairwells, and uninsulated corners became repositories of ice-cold air, and sleepers instinctively shifted closer to walls that retained the smallest fraction of day-warmed heat. You could sense the quiet vigilance required even while lying down. The body adjusted constantly, curling tighter, repositioning limbs, or pressing closer to another person to preserve warmth. Sleep, though desired, was never entirely unguarded. It was a negotiation with environment as much as with fatigue. In households where servants or workers shared sleeping quarters, conditions were even more constrained. Cots lined in rows, or simple straw mattresses pressed together on cold floors, created a landscape of endurance. Each breath, each movement, was a reminder of the body's limits and the constant, gentle pressure of winter's cold. Noise was minimal, almost reverent, but every creak of timber, shuffle of clothing, or cough echoed softly in the still night, punctuating the hours as a measure of persistence. Even the smallest discomfort became amplified in the quiet, shaping awareness and reinforcing the gradual rhythm of endurance. The architecture itself imposed its will. High ceilings allowed warm air to rise, leaving the lower sleeping areas colder. Stone walls absorbed heat during the day, but radiated it away overnight, returning the chill to the interiors. Drafts through doorways, poorly sealed window frames, and gaps in floorboards created subtle, moving currents of cold, forcing constant adjustments. You shifted to avoid direct drafts, tucked limbs into blankets, and huddled nearer to others. The night demanded attention even when the mind sought oblivion. Rest was a careful balance of surrender and self-preservation. In wealthier homes, attempts at comfort, feathers, extra blankets, or heated footstools softened but never eliminated the discomfort. Even small luxuries served as reminders of the prevailing inadequacy. They created pockets of warmth, transient and uneven, that forced sleepers to adapt continually. Servants might rotate embers in the hearth or replenish hot water bottles, each movement a measured intervention to preserve the fragile balance of comfort. Every human gesture became part of the infrastructure of survival, quietly choreographed to sustain heat for as long as possible. Night, therefore, was a slow, unrelenting test. It was not marked by dramatic events, but by continuous, subtle negotiation with the environment. Time passed almost imperceptibly. Minutes stretched, each hour heavier than the last. The body, already fatigued from the day's work, adapted to discomfort, teaching restraint, patience, and awareness. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and punctuated by the imperatives of survival. Even in quiet moments, the mind registered cold, hunger, and fatigue, not as immediate danger, but as persistent companions, shaping posture, breathing, and awareness. By the deepest hours before dawn, the room became a tableau of endurance. Figures shifted, whispered softly, adjusted blankets, and drew nearer to whatever sources of heat remained. Breath condensed visibly, fingers flexed against stiffness, and every small movement was part of a delicate balance between surrender and preservation. You understood, without need for emphasis, that rest in Victorian winter was never fully restful. The body was always negotiating, always aware, and the night always demanded vigilance, no matter how quiet it appeared from the outside. As the night deepened, the hearths that had promised comfort began their quiet decline. Coal embers faded slowly, and the flicker of flame, once steady, waned into occasional sparks. Even in wealthier households, maintaining heat required constant attention, and the effort of tending fires through a long winter night was both physical and mental. You could feel the subtle shift in the room as warmth receded, leaving spaces colder than they had been just an hour before. Shadows stretched longer along walls and ceilings, and the air thickened with the soft, tangible presence of frost settling over furniture, floors, and window panes. The process was gradual. Wood crackled softly, then became silent, leaving only the faint glow of embers to remind you of the heat that had been. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying the faint scent of soot and resin into the still air. You noticed the way the cold traveled, first creeping across the stone floors, then climbing the walls, reaching corners where blankets and cushions had offered minimal protection. Every breath became visible, a small cloud in front of your face, reminding you that the body's warmth was not enough to fully resist the night. Even the hearth's dying light seemed to emphasize the expanse of darkness beyond it, a silent measure of hours yet to pass. In many homes, fires were shared among multiple rooms, their warmth diluted as it spread through corridors or under doors. The upper floors, or bedrooms farthest from the hearth, grew cold first. Floorboards radiated chill upward, and drafts from windows or poorly sealed doors carried icy currents through the spaces where sleepers lay. You could sense the shift in body posture as people instinctively huddled closer to the remaining heat, curling inward, drawing blankets tighter, or pressing closer to one another. Even small movements became strategic, a negotiation with the ever-retreating warmth. Those responsible for fire maintenance, often the eldest child, a servant, or a watchful household member, moved quietly, adding small logs, fanning embers, or adjusting coals. Each action required care. Too much oxygen, and the fire would flare and consume wood too quickly. Too little, and it would smolder ineffectively, producing more smoke than warmth. You could almost hear the subtle rhythm of these interventions, the soft thuds of logs settling, the occasional hiss as embers met new fuel, the faint movement of smoke curling toward the chimney. In these small gestures, the household negotiated a fragile balance, delaying the inevitable decline of heat while allowing the night to continue. In the wealthiest homes, some rooms benefited from supplemental stoves or braziers. Yet even these could not fully counteract the night's persistence. Fires required attention, and attention demanded wakefulness, however slight. You might lie awake, listening to the faint crackle or pop of embers, feeling the temperature fluctuate with each small adjustment. The contrast between a momentarily restored warmth and the return of cold was subtle but insistent, a gentle, hypnotic measure of the hours. Sleep, when it came, was never entirely uninterrupted, each shift in embers or the drop of a log echoing softly, drawing the sleeper's awareness back to the present. In smaller homes, or those with fewer resources, the situation was harsher. Coal and wood were rationed, fires allowed to burn lower or die completely to conserve fuel for morning. The cold, once unopposed, infiltrated every corner. The floors, walls, and ceilings became vectors for persistent chill. You felt it not only against skin, but within muscles, stiffening limbs and slowing even the smallest movements. Breath formed steadily, a reminder of the temperature that no bedding could fully mitigate. Every sound, the settling of the house, the soft movement of animals, the distant creak of a door, served as a quiet marker of the body's constant vigilance. Despite the challenges, there was a rhythm to endurance. The household had long-established routines. Embers stirred at intervals, logs moved to different hearth positions, and a shared understanding of when heat would be most needed guided movements. Children learned the subtle art of curling near warmth without disturbing it, while adults rotated between tending fires and resting. Even as warmth ebbed and flowed, the community operated in quiet coordination, balancing personal comfort with collective survival. You could sense the slow passage of time, measured less in minutes than in shifts of heat and cold, in the soft glow of embers rising and falling. The psychological dimension of dying fires was subtle but significant. Warmth, once plentiful, receded, creating a gentle unease rather than sudden alarm. Sleep felt more precious, but also more precarious. You adjusted, curled closer, and monitored the faint light of embers as though the room's survival depended on them. This quiet tension, absent of drama or fear, carried through the night, teaching a slow, steady awareness of vulnerability and endurance. It was a nightly lesson in patience, observation, and the delicate balance between surrendering to rest and maintaining minimal comfort. By the hours approaching midnight, most rooms were dimly lit by the residual glow of embers or a single lamp. Smoke hung in soft patterns along ceilings and walls, blending with faint frost forming near window panes. The cold was more insistent now, moving in imperceptible currents, forcing bodies to adjust continuously. Each breath, each stretch of limbs, each subtle shift in position became part of an ongoing negotiation with both the environment and one's own bodily limits. Night, in this way, was not a pause from discomfort, but a continuous, unbroken measure of endurance. Even as the fire ebbed, the quiet work of sustaining warmth created a lullaby of routine. The soft clink of coals, the faint hiss of embers, the occasional rustle of clothing or bedding. These sounds became markers of time, each small act contributing to the household's survival while allowing the mind to drift gradually into rest. You could imagine lying amidst the shadows, feeling the slow decrease of heat, sensing the imperceptible chill creeping along walls and floors, and understanding that the endurance of night was as much about attention and habit as it was about temperature itself. As the night stretched on, the hours began to feel endless. Time, measured not in the usual rhythms of day, but in subtle changes in warmth, flickering candlelight, and the quiet breathing of those around you, seemed to slow. Every creak of the house, every faint shuffle of feet or settling of stone walls, marked a passage of moments that were simultaneously familiar and oppressive. The body, once able to respond quickly to cold or discomfort, now moved sluggishly, wrapped in layers of clothing and blankets, conserving energy as instinct demanded. You might find yourself aware of the stretch of floorboards beneath you, the hardness of mattresses, or the uneven drafts curling around corners, each sensation magnified by the silence. Sleep came intermittently, in shallow waves, disrupted by the shifting embers of fires, the faint whisper of wind through cracks in the windows, or the soft cough of a fellow sleeper. Even when eyes closed fully, awareness remained, a subconscious monitoring of temperature and comfort. You learned quickly to adjust posture without opening your eyes, to stretch or shift weight gradually, to tuck limbs closer to conserve warmth, and to breathe slowly to avoid drawing in icy air too abruptly. These were small, repeated motions, barely noticeable, yet crucial for enduring the remainder of the night. In households where servants or family members rotated fire maintenance, there was a rhythm to the activity. A small log was added here, embers stirred there, a door cracked to release smoke, only to be sealed again when the chill crept inward. Each minor intervention punctuated the quiet night, a reminder that even the simplest measures were necessary for survival. The interplay of human effort and environmental pressure created a subtle tension, never alarming, yet persistent enough that complete relaxation was impossible. Sleep and wakefulness blended together in a slow, hypnotic pattern, allowing the body to rest only in intervals. The cold intensified as hours passed. Upper rooms, or those furthest from the hearth, became progressively stiffer and less forgiving. Even those sleeping near fires or braziers could feel the warmth fade in waves. a constant reminder that no single source of heat could fully dominate the night. Fingers, toes, and extremities felt the first sharp effects of the temperature drop, stiffening subtly, while core warmth was maintained only through huddling, layering, and careful body positioning. The human body, resilient yet limited, adapted slowly to the persistent chill, teaching endurance as both a physical and mental exercise. Throughout these hours, attention became a quiet discipline. The mind, lulled by dim light and monotony, could drift but never fully disengage. Thoughts wandered, sometimes to mundane concerns of the next day, sometimes to memories or imagined comforts, but always returned to the tangible reality of the room. The weight of blankets, the faint smell of smoke and soot, the texture of frost along window panes, the soft presence of others. This slow awareness, without urgency or drama, became a form of meditation, an acceptance of discomfort that both soothed and reminded a paradoxical rhythm of rest and vigilance. Some people remained awake longer than others, driven by habit or necessity. Children might stir periodically, small noises echoing across rooms, reminding others of the shared endurance. Elderly or infirm individuals shifted with care, their bodies less able to withstand the cold without frequent micro-movements or adjustments. In communal sleeping arrangements, these small disturbances were absorbed quietly, everyone negotiating space, warmth, and comfort without overt disruption. The night, in this sense, was not empty or static. It was full of micro-interactions, each imperceptible yet integral to the collective persistence through hours that seemed to stretch indefinitely. The mental and emotional toll of these long hours was subtle but persistent. A calm awareness of danger, cold as a relentless force rather than a sudden threat, permeated every action. You learned to anticipate discomfort before it fully manifested, to notice the creeping stiffness in joints, the faint chill in the air, or the subtle dimming of candlelight, and to respond with minimal, deliberate gestures. Sleep remained a fragile companion, arriving in brief interludes, while wakefulness demanded quiet observation and gentle adaptation. Animals shared the space in many households, offering warmth and companionship. Cats, dogs, and other small creatures curled near humans, contributing heat and presence without requiring attention beyond gentle awareness. Their breathing, movements, and occasional stirring became part of the rhythm of the night, a subtle reassurance that life continued even as discomfort persisted. The interplay of human and animal endurance reinforced the hypnotic pattern of vigilance and rest, deepening the slow, meditative pace of the night. By the final hours before dawn, the night had been endured, but not without ongoing attention. The body's stiffness, the lingering chill, and the careful adjustments made through hours of darkness created a quiet, almost ritualistic pattern. Each participant, whether tending a fire, shifting in a shared bed, or simply breathing slowly in the cold, contributed to a collective passage through time that was at once hypnotic, taxing, and subtly instructive. You could feel the hours layered upon one another, each marked by endurance, routine, and the soft insistence of winter. In this way, the longest hours of the night became an endurance plateau, where neither relief nor excitement intruded. Time passed slowly, measured in breath, in embers, in the subtle shift of frost and shadows. Sleep was intermittent, but the mind and body were both engaged in a quiet, necessary rhythm of survival. There was no heroism, no drama, only a persistent, calm negotiation with the cold, darkness, and time itself. The night taught endurance in its most understated form, leaving listeners immersed in the hypnotic, reflective rhythm of survival. The children and the elderly, more than anyone else, felt the night's cold and the winter's relentlessness most acutely. Their bodies, either still developing or slowly declining, lacked the resilience to endure prolonged discomfort without noticeable strain. In quiet, dimly lit rooms, you could almost sense their fragility, not dramatic, not tragic, but persistent. Every shiver, Every small adjustment of limbs, every shallow breath carried the weight of vulnerability. These were individuals whose survival depended on the rhythm and vigilance of others, whose endurance was never entirely self-sufficient. Children, often tucked together in shared beds or on straw-filled mattresses, learned early the lessons of winter. They curled tightly, instinctively seeking warmth from siblings or parents, breathing slowly to conserve heat. Limbs were drawn close, blankets layered meticulously, sometimes too many layers for comfort, but necessary for survival. The youngest, unable to articulate discomfort fully, were observed carefully by those nearby. Small hands and feet, often cold and stiff, were guided gently into positions that maximized warmth. Each adjustment was a quiet negotiation between the body's instinct and the surrounding care. Elderly individuals faced a different challenge. Their joints were stiffened by age, their circulatory system slower, and their reserves of energy limited. Simple actions that younger people performed without thought, turning in bed, adjusting a blanket, moving closer to a fire, required effort, sometimes considerable. The cold pressed against them more persistently, seeping through heavy layers of clothing, settling in joints and bones, making every shift deliberate. They often slept lightly, never fully surrendering to rest, attuned to the environment and the needs of those around them. The night, long and monotonous, was measured in these cautious movements, these quiet negotiations of comfort and survival. In households where multiple generations shared a room, there was a subtle hierarchy of positioning. Children were often placed close to adults or near heat sources. Elderly figures were similarly arranged to benefit from warmth and minimal drafts. Even small gestures, a hand brushed over a cold arm, a blanket gently tucked around a frail body, were critical. These actions were repeated throughout the night, almost imperceptible to anyone not attuned, but essential to maintaining steady endurance. The room itself became a delicate ecosystem of shared warmth, human bodies pressed against one another, each movement calculated to maximize comfort and minimize exposure. The rhythms of the night dictated the pace of life. Children shifted in restless sleep, sometimes whispering, sometimes rolling onto a colder patch of floor. Adults and older siblings responded gently, adjusting blankets, repositioning limbs, coaxing warmth back to small bodies. The elderly, sensitive to both cold and noise, often stirred when blankets were moved or when the faint crackle of embers changed. These subtle interactions formed a hypnotic pattern of vigilance and care, where the passage of time was marked by minor adjustments rather than by clocks or external signals. Food scarcity compounded the struggle. Children's energy levels waned without sufficient sustenance, and the elderly, already limited in reserves, found the night harder to endure. Hunger, like cold, was a quiet companion, persistent and inescapable. Small portions of porridge, bread, or stew were rationed carefully throughout the day and into evening, often leaving the night with little more than the warmth of shared bodies to sustain life. The endurance required was both physical and mental, a quiet, continual negotiation between instinct, necessity, and limited resources. Even in well-off households, these vulnerabilities were never fully mitigated. Fires could fade, rooms could grow drafty, and heavy fabrics could not entirely shield against penetrating cold. The imagination might conjure modern comfort, but the reality was subtler and stricter. Children and elderly individuals learned, through repetition and quiet observation, how to survive these circumstances. Layering, curling, adjusting, huddling, stretching, and releasing tension were repeated over and over, each iteration a small victory over the night's slow challenges. The sensory experience was as significant as the physical endurance. Faint candlelight cast long shadows over the frost on windows, and the smell of coal, soot, and damp would mingle with the warmth of human bodies. Breaths were visible in the cold air, curling upwards in small clouds. The room seemed to contract and expand with the movements of its occupants, the shuffling of feet, the soft rustle of blankets, the gentle sighs of children or elderly figures adjusting to maintain balance. These subtleties, unnoticed by an inattentive eye, formed the hypnotic rhythm that dominated long nights in winter. By observing these patterns, you can appreciate how survival was a quiet, sustained effort, far removed from drama or sudden danger. Children learned endurance through repetition and care, while the elderly relied on instinct, assistance, and careful attention to the subtle signals of the environment. Both groups were acutely aware, consciously or not, that each hour carried its own challenges. No single action ensured comfort. Survival emerged through cumulative, consistent, and deliberate behavior. Even the quietest rooms held a certain tension, a constant awareness that cold could return, that embers might die, that blankets could shift away. The night did not demand panic, only attention, patience, and careful adaptation. The gentle discomfort became a teacher, and the subtle endurance, a skill passed from generation to generation. In these long, measured hours, children and elderly alike were simultaneously vulnerable and capable, dependent and persistent, resting and alert. It was an intricate balance, observed in stillness and subtle motion, in the rhythmic breath of many bodies pressed close together for warmth. The servants and workers of Victorian households experienced a winter and Christmas unlike the leisurely illusions we often imagine. Their day began long before sunrise, often before even the smallest hint of light touched frost-laden windows, and ended hours after the household had settled for the night. For them, discomfort was continuous, a constant companion woven into every movement and task. You could sense it in the stiff shoulders carrying heavy water buckets, in the careful steps across stone floors still cold from the night, in the quiet adjustments of layered garments pressed against the body for warmth. Servants tended to the fires, coals, and stoves throughout the day and into the evening. In kitchens, the heat was uneven and fleeting. Large stone hearths radiated warmth only in pockets, leaving corners of the room cold, damp, and inhospitable. Firewood had to be chopped, stacked, and stoked at precise intervals. Too little heat, and the household would shiver. Too much, and food could burn. Workers moved deliberately, balancing speed with caution, their muscles gradually fatigued but persistently engaged. The cold seeped through even the thickest clothing, making every motion a negotiation with the environment. In these households, the servants' endurance extended beyond physical effort. There was constant vigilance, checking on embers before they died, stirring thick stews over fluctuating heat, moving quietly so as not to disturb those attempting to rest. Even in well-heated rooms, drafts lurked near doors and windows, and the chill of stone floors spread silently beneath them. The body adapted slowly, fingers stiffened, backs ached, feet grew numb. Yet the work continued. Their very presence was an invisible infrastructure, a soft, persistent hum of human energy, sustaining the household's warmth and function. The winter months, especially around Christmas, brought additional labor and strain. Tasks multiplied not from necessity alone, but from societal expectation. The household had to appear festive, abundant, and cheerful. Decorations, evergreens, candles, wreaths had to be arranged carefully, yet they offered no warmth themselves, only a semblance of cheer. Guests might arrive, formal dinners prepared, tables laid with care, but the warmth that might have comforted the hosts never truly reached those who labored behind the scenes. Servants moved from kitchen to hall, from pantry to scullery, the rhythm of work dictating the passage of hours more than sunlight or clock. You could feel the monotony and endurance blend. Each repetition of task, each careful adjustment of fire or food, a small victory against the unrelenting cold. Sleep, when it came, was brief and fragmented. Workers retired late, often into shared quarters or sparsely furnished rooms, huddled under thin blankets or straw mattresses. Cold surfaces seeped through, and exhaustion brought no immediate relief. The body remained aware of the environment. Any lapse in attention could mean a fire dying, food spoiling, or a draft chilling the household further. In these moments, the hypnotic rhythm of endurance dominated. Steady breaths, careful repositioning, the faint creak of wooden floors under cautious steps, all part of a continuous awareness that comfort was temporary, fragile, and earned only through vigilance. Children of servants learned early the lessons of household labor, assisting where they could without complaint, understanding that warmth and survival depended on careful action. They might carry small baskets of coal, move firewood, or deliver dishes silently to minimize disturbance. Even the smallest task carried significance, a subtle preparation for the long nights and early mornings that defined their lives. Observation and mimicry became survival tools, and the quiet endurance of adults set a steady pace that children absorbed almost instinctively. Victorian workers, whether indoor servants or those performing essential external labor, lived in an environment where comfort was never assumed. Streets outside were bitter with frost. Coal smoke and gaslight mingled with the icy air. Traveling between tasks, fetching supplies, or performing errands exposed them to relentless cold, damp, and fatigue. Each return to the household offered momentary relief. Yet indoors, warmth was rationed, uneven, and always dependent on attention. You can imagine the rhythm of the day measured less by clock hands and more by the slow fading and resurgence of heat, by the careful rotation of tasks, by the ongoing, invisible negotiation between body, environment, and duty. The endurance required of servants and workers was both physical and mental. Fatigue accumulated slowly but persistently, body and mind attuned to the environment in almost meditative fashion. Hands grew rough, joints stiffened, breath came in visible puffs near hearths. Yet each motion, each carefully timed action, ensured the household survive comfortably, or at least survive at all. Their labor was quiet, uncelebrated, yet central to the rhythm of Victorian Christmas life, to the difference between the household appearing festive and functional, and succumbing to the chill and monotony of winter. In observing these patterns, you can perceive the hypnotic nature of endurance. The servant's life was not marked by sudden peril, but by continuous pressure, by a slow accumulation of fatigue and subtle exposure. Each repetition, each careful adjustment of fire, food, or bedding was a step in a quiet, invisible dance of survival. Their bodies responded slowly to the cold, their minds calibrated to observe and react to subtle changes in the environment. In this way, time stretched differently for them. Long hours punctuated by small victories of warmth and function. Nights felt longer, and Christmas, rather than a festival of joy, became a prolonged test of quiet endurance. Outside the warmth of hearth and home, the cold of Victorian winters was far more unforgiving. Those without roofs over their heads, street children, beggars, itinerant laborers, faced a world defined by exposure, scarcity, and unending vigilance. The night was long, each hour stretching with biting frost and the quiet ache of hunger. There were no cozy rooms to return to, no coal fires to tend, no soft beds to collapse into. Instead, the streets, alleys, and workhouses offered only minimal shelter and a persistent reminder that survival required constant adaptation and awareness. Without walls to trap heat, the environment pressed directly against skin and bone. Clothing, often tattered and layered in mismatched fabrics, provided uneven protection. Each step across frozen streets, each crouch behind a doorway or under a shop awning, exposed gaps where cold could enter. You can imagine the small calculations performed constantly, shifting weight to preserve circulation, curling tightly to conserve heat, pressing hands into pockets or against the body. Fatigue accumulated quickly, muscles stiffened, and sleep became a delicate negotiation between rest and vulnerability. The night stretched interminably, the body aware of its own limits, of the creeping chill that would not relent. For children, the danger was particularly acute. Frail bodies lost heat rapidly, small fingers and toes turning pale, numb, and slow. Hunger dulled energy, and exhaustion made simple movements burdensome. Yet there was also a quiet ingenuity, wrapping in discarded rags, huddling in groups, seeking any small pocket of warmth, perhaps a coal ember's glow leaking from a window or a sheltered doorway. These measures never promised comfort, only a slight reprieve, a temporary pause in the unyielding winter's grip. Workhouses and shelters provided some relief, though it was limited and regimented. Rooms were crowded, beds sparse, and warmth scarce. Heat was rationed, food measured, and silence often enforced. For those who arrived late or outside the system, there was no refuge. The night's endurance demanded patience, stillness, and keen awareness of surroundings. Movement carried risk, not only of exposure, but of theft, displacement, or reprimand. Survival became an exercise in quiet vigilance, an ongoing, hypnotic cycle of observation, adjustment, and careful breath. During the Christmas season, the contrast between public celebration and private struggle was stark. Festive displays, candlelight, and carolers moved along the streets. But for those without homes, these sights offered no comfort. If anything, they highlighted scarcity, the warmth behind doors they could not enter, the tables of abundance they could not reach, the laughter and lights that seemed almost intolerable against the unyielding cold. Hunger intensified, the long hours dragged on, and the mind turned to small, practical details, where to find the next warmth, the next morsel, the next momentary shelter. The hypnotic repetition of need and survival dominated every hour. Yet there was endurance, even here, subtle and pervasive. Small routines emerged, circling familiar streets, choosing places that blocked the wind, collecting discarded firewood, or wrapping in layers scavenged from refuse. Bodies adjusted slowly, developing resilience, though never immunity, to the harsh environment. Breath became visible in the frosty air, each exhalation a reminder of presence, life, and the quiet miracle of continued existence. Time passed differently in this context. Nights felt longer, days emerged cautiously, and the minutes between the warmth of midday and the chill of evening were measured in subtle shifts of sensation, effort, and awareness. The psychological endurance was as important as the physical. To survive meant to remain calm, to conserve energy, to maintain hope without expectation of comfort. Watching the frost crack along window panes, seeing families move through the snow with packages and laughter, one learned patience, restraint, and a gentle, meditative awareness of circumstance. The mind habituated to the slow, relentless pressures of winter, finding rhythm in repetition, shifting, huddling, observing, waiting, adjusting, and enduring. As dawn approached, the streets revealed a fragile, tentative light. Shadows stretched long across cobblestones and frozen puddles. The body, still shivering, continued to rely on the environment for subtle cues. A warm alleyway, a hint of early sunlight on stone, the distant smoke of a fire. Each sensory input offered a delicate guidance, a gentle rhythm for survival, and an implicit promise that the long night, while unforgiving, would eventually give way to the muted warmth of day. For listeners, this segment emphasizes subtle, hypnotic endurance. The challenges of homelessness in Victorian winters were never sudden or dramatic. They were slow, cumulative, and mentally taxing. Time dragged, the body adjusted gradually, and every moment became an exercise in quiet observation, patience, and careful movement. The rhythm of exposure, minimal shelter, and tenuous warmth creates a gentle, lulling cadence, the body and mind responding to slow, steady pressures rather than sudden shocks. Christmas, in this context, was neither joyous nor festive. It was prolonged, measured, and quietly demanding of resilience. Even in suffering, there was structure, routines repeated nightly, methods refined through experience, and a small community of observers and fellow survivors sometimes formed unspoken alliances for warmth or protection. The hypnotic quality of endurance dominated the narrative. Hours drifted by, actions repeated, breath visible in the air, movement minimal yet intentional. Each moment of survival became a quiet meditation, a step in the ongoing pattern of Victorian winter life, and a reminder of the stark contrast between what we imagine and what truly was. As the story of Victorian Christmas draws to a close, it is worth pausing and reflecting on the quiet contrast between the imagination of holiday cheer and the reality experienced by most people at the time. Today, when you think of Christmas, perhaps warmth, light, and abundance come easily to mind. Brightly decorated rooms, fires crackling, tables heavy with food, and laughter flowing freely. Yet, for the majority of Victorians, the season was far from comfortable. It was a time defined less by celebration than by endurance, less by warmth than by the persistent chill, and less by leisure than by labor and obligation. Even in homes that might have seemed welcoming, heat was often inadequate. Coal was expensive, and fireplaces were shared sparingly. Drafts slipped through cracks in doors and windows, chilling bodies layer by layer. Clothing could only do so much. The layers of wool, flannel, and cotton offered protection, but the winter's bite was relentless. Hunger, too, was never far from anyone's mind. The feasts of the wealthier classes, so often celebrated in literature and later illustration, were beyond reach for many, leaving only the quiet discomfort of reduced rations, thin soups, and bread that barely filled the stomach. For children and the elderly, the cold and hunger were more than mere inconvenience. They were constant pressures on small and fragile bodies. Sleep arrived slowly, fitful and light, and the night seemed to stretch endlessly. For servants and laborers, the obligations of work and ritual compounded the strain. Long hours, extra tasks during holiday festivities, and a strict adherence to social expectations left little room for rest. And for those without homes, there was no reprieve at all. Streets and alleys were cold and unforgiving, and survival demanded constant vigilance. The night was long, the days taxing, and comfort was a concept almost entirely foreign. Even the psychological landscape of Christmas was different. Whereas we now associate the season with joy, laughter, and celebration, Victorians often experienced pressure, expectation, and quiet anxiety. The obligation to display happiness, to perform in social gatherings, and to fulfill religious duties created an invisible weight. The mind, already fatigued by cold and hunger, had to maintain composure, project cheer, and navigate the intricate networks of household and society. Survival was as much mental as physical, each small action carefully measured to conserve energy and maintain warmth. Yet within this reality, there was also endurance, subtle and hypnotic. Life moved in rhythms dictated by the season and environment. The slow preparation of meals, the careful layering of clothing, the attentiveness to embers and fires, and the repeated steps of maintaining hygiene, order, and routine. Even in discomfort, there was a quiet meditation in repetition. Hours stretched and passed, each small act forming a protective rhythm, a measure of resilience. The mind and body adapted, learning the slow art of endurance, of noticing small cues from the environment and responding with deliberate, measured actions. Christmas, therefore, was a season that magnified the challenges already present in winter. The very idea of celebration could increase strain, with more work to prepare, more social obligations to meet, and more hunger to endure in the shadow of feasts enjoyed by others. The cold became more insistent, the nights longer, and the demands on body and mind heavier. Yet, the human response was persistent. Adaptation, observation, careful conservation, and the gentle repetition of small tasks created a framework for surviving the season. For us, in this quiet moment of reflection, it becomes apparent that the warmth we feel now, the soft glow of lamps, the scent of a freshly baked meal, the comfort of a bed, is something that Victorian people could only imagine. They endured without the modern conveniences we take for granted. Their experience reminds us that what we remember from history, or what we imagine it to be, is often a selective, softened version of reality. The reality was slower, colder, and quieter. It demanded patience, vigilance, and endurance. The survival of each day, each night, each Christmas was a quiet achievement, a testament to human resilience that required no heroics, only careful attention and persistence. As you listen, perhaps you notice the rhythm of time, the ebb and flow of small efforts, the visible breath in cold rooms, the shifting of bodies for warmth, and the subtle sounds of a house or street at night. These are the elements that defined a Victorian Christmas for most people. Not grand celebrations, not abundant gifts, not roaring fires, but measured endurance, the slow passing of hours, and the quiet adaptation to discomfort. By paying attention to these details, you are invited to witness history not as a series of events or images, but as a lived experience, one that unfolds gradually, rhythmically, and hypnotically, guiding both mind and body into stillness. The contrast is gentle but striking. Today's Christmas is bright and warm, filled with the sense of food, the glow of lights, and the sense of abundance. For the Victorians, it was a season of quiet, almost meditative survival. The careful tending of fires, the adjustment of blankets and clothing, the rationing of food, the attention to body and environment, and the patience to endure long hours of darkness. The mind, fatigued yet attentive, became trained to notice subtle shifts in temperature, light, and routine. The body, slowed by cold and hunger, learned the small adjustments necessary to persist through nights that might feel unending. Perhaps you can imagine the small, almost imperceptible triumphs of those who endured. A child curling tightly to stay warm, a servant quietly stoking a dying ember, a worker finding a sheltered corner to rest, or a family huddling together for mutual warmth. These moments formed the fabric of real Christmas experience. There is no drama, no overt spectacle, only the hypnotic, unhurried passage of time and the subtle artistry of endurance. And now, as the narration winds down, the gentle invitation is for your mind to drift, for your attention to soften, and for the quiet lessons of the past to settle. The warmth you feel now, whether from a nearby heater, a blanket, or the simple comfort of being seated safely, is part of a continuum, a reminder of what people endured, what they imagined, and what we now take for granted. The cold, the darkness, the hunger, and the quiet labor of Christmas past are distant, yet they shaped lives in ways subtle but profound. So as you prepare to rest, perhaps close your eyes and allow the rhythm of this story to linger. The slow, deliberate cycles of cold and warmth, labor and pause, night and day, echo in a gentle cadence designed for reflection and sleep. The reality of Victorian Christmas, so different from what we imagine, is not a tale of shock or sorrow, but a meditation on human resilience, patience, and the quiet strength found in endurance. The warmth you feel now is something they could only imagine, and in that thought lies the gentle, lingering awareness of history as it was truly lived, measured, hypnotic, and enduring.